Marginal pricing, or pays cleared, or uniform pricing, as it's sometimes called, is not an artificial way of organizing electricity markets. It's really the natural way of how prices are formed, of how prices emerge in free economies, in all markets, in all commodities. You could say that commodities price on the margin, and so does electricity.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to a special episode of our Energy Unplugged podcast. My name is Hans Koenig. I lead the Berlin office of Aurora, and I'm being joined today by two of the leading experts on power market design in Europe today, Leon Hirth and Rob Gross. Hi, Leon.
Hi, Hans.
And hi, Rob.
Hello, Hans.
Real pleasure to have you on the show. So to briefly introduce our guests, Leon Hirth is a professor of energy policy at the Hertie School here in Berlin. He's one of the leading thinkers on power market design in Europe. He holds a PhD from Technical University of Berlin, focusing on the economics of wind and solar variability, and is also director of his own consulting firm, Neon, with which we as Aurora collaborate every now and then in the sense of full disclosure and full transparency. Rob Gross is the director of UKERC, the UK Energy Research Centre, and also a professor of energy policy at Imperial College in London. He's an authority on power market design in Great Britain and holds a PhD in energy and environment policy also from Imperial College. So two very distinguished guests. We are very fortunate they managed to find the time in their busy schedules to join us on the pod today. To set the scene a little bit, I would like to ask Leon to take us through what is going on in European power markets right now, and where we even stand and why we're having a discussion about market design.
I guess the starting point is that wholesale market prices going crazy. So roughly speaking, the sort of the most important market in Germany, the frontier future market that is electricity to be delivered during the course of the next year, now stands at 560 euros per megawatt hour, and that compares to a long-term average of something like 40 euros per megawatt hour. Even compared to the most crazy times we all can remember, the commodity frenzy of 2008, and adjusting for inflation, back then the very same price was only slightly above 100 euros. So we are 5 times above the all-time high, and that of course has tremendous impacts not only for firms that become uncompetitive, but also for individual citizens and households, where the social impact will be very, very severe.
Why are power prices so high? Is this just chance? Is this just speculation? Or why are we seeing these high prices?
There's a few factors, but certainly the most important factor is the high gas price that is triggered by the supply interruption caused by Vladimir Putin, essentially, and Gazprom, who stopped delivering European markets. And those high gas prices trigger then down to high electricity prices. There's a few secondary factors in electricity, in particular the low availability of French nuclear for a number of reasons, as well as the massive droughts that diminishes hydroelectricity generation across Southern Europe, but also causes trouble in coal delivery in countries such as Germany, where coal is often shipped in barges through the River Rhine.
Okay, so a lot of it is gas, but there's also other drivers such as the French nuclear outages, shipping, and so forth. Are the topics the same in the UK or in the British market, Rob, or are there any peculiar features to Great Britain?
No, I don't. I mean, there's nothing. We don't have very much hydro. We do have some nuclear providing various 12, 15, up to about 20% of our generation mix. But as with mainland Europe, the predominant factor that's driving the price increases, and we've seen prices increase through the course of last autumn, 500%, and went up to a kind of 6-fold increase early this year. And that's because the price setting generation plant on the GB system is the gas-fired GGTs. They don't actually provide the majority of our energy on an annual basis. They provide something like 40%. with something like 60% coming from a mixture of imports, renewables, and nuclear. But they are the marginal plant. We'll come on to talk about what that means. They set the price, and in my view, the gas price crisis is completely overriding all other factors in terms of what's happening with the price of electricity at the moment.
Okay, interesting. So gas prices really dominate everything. So why are we even having a debate about market design then? Because we've had a market design that's delivered pretty low prices, all things considered, for most of the past decade in the GB market, in the continental European markets. And the market design didn't change, right? All that changed is that gas prices got more expensive. So why is this triggering a debate about changing the market design?
I think there's two things that I would say in response to that. The first thing is we were having a debate in many countries about the long-term electricity market design fundamentals before this crisis blew up. The reason that conversation, we were having that debate, is because of the increasing share of variable renewables and the different characteristics that those types of generation have, and the impact that has on price formation in markets. In particular, the tendency for wind farms, for example, for their outputs to correlate. So on a windy day, prices tend to be low, and on a not very windy day, prices tend to be high. That can affect the investment case for renewables, and it can affect what happens with the balance of plants. So that's the plant that kind of flex gas generators, for example, to compensate for the variation in the output of those renewables, and our carbon aspirations. You know, across Europe and in many other countries, we're hoping great things for renewables in the next 20 years. And so it's important that the investment case for renewables stacks up. I know this is something that Aurora have paid attention to in some of your thought pieces. You know, how do we ensure that investors are attracted into these new forms of technology? We know that they can deliver electricity now at low levelized costs, but we also know that their system costs and their characteristics mean that the investment case might be a bit risky. So we were having this conversation already in many parts of the world, and this was overlaid by this crisis that actually emerged during last year as the COVID lockdowns ended and supply had been restricted in some countries of oil and gas. There's a kind of boom and bust cycle there, with demand racing away, supply not keeping up, but also the actions of the Russian government and then subsequently the war in Ukraine. And I think many countries, certainly in the British context, and we've seen this in a number of other European countries, people are quite legitimately asking the question, okay, why are we paying wind farms or nuclear power stations hundreds of pounds per megawatt hour when it seemed as if they were perfectly profitable a few months ago, being paid £50 or 60 euros or 50 euros, it's the same per megawatt hour. And so that, I think, is the origins of this debate.
Okay, so it's concerns about equity, about fairness with regards to some very high returns being made by renewable generators in particular at the moment, you would say. Leon, would you concur with that, or is there anything else you would add?
I think that's very much the same debate we're having in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, and elsewhere. So essentially, it's the very high cost to electricity and gas consumers that, in the case of electricity, comes along with certain generators. It's not all the renewables, right? But it's certain generators that are earning high profits. We will talk about these profits in the following, and maybe profits aren't that high as many people believe, but still, in some cases they are, and that's perceived as unfair. And that, of course, doesn't go down well with citizens and policymakers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think I'd qualify that a little bit, because I think certainly in the GB context, it's not necessarily focused on fairness. I think, you know, there is a concern about excess rents, and particularly where some of the renewables get a subsidy on top of the wholesale price, which made sense when the wholesale price was low and renewables were more expensive, and seems to make less sense now. But actually, I think that governments are also genuinely desperately looking for things that they might do quickly to reduce the burden of these very high prices. They don't see a way to do anything about the input prices, the costs of gas. They do see the potential maybe to do something to reduce electricity prices. And so they're looking very seriously at whether or not that's possible. The fairness aspect of it, in inverted commas for our listeners, because you can't see me gesticulating, we can debate.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's very high prices to consumers, and governments looking for solutions to that, and potentially fairness coming together. Okay, so before we go into a market design, the current market design debate, and what proposals are on the table to change that, I would like to talk a little bit history and theory, and explain why we ended up with today's market design, power market design, where we have the merit order, where we have the most expensive plant that is required to meet demand, setting the price for everyone in the first place. Rob, could you take us through how things developed over the past decades and years, and how we ended up where we are?
Certainly, I will do that. I'll try and keep it fairly brief, and not have too much of a history lesson. But if you look back over the history of electricity markets around the world, so the first thing to say is if you go back 30 years or so, they weren't markets in the sense that they are now, in that they were either, in the European context for the most part, nationalized and vertically integrated, and in the States they were privately owned, but also vertically integrated, tightly regulated monopolies. The idea of a merit order was an economic concept that was created in order to make sure that those monopolies were running their generation plant in the most economically optimal way. If you look around the world, some countries still don't actually use a merit order. They operate according to quotas, according to whether or not a particular region needs to be given, revenues by running their coal plants, for example, as historically has been the case in China. But the idea of a merit order is pretty simple, really. You run your cheapest plants first. So if you've got some plants with zero marginal costs, run them all the time. And then you run a power station that's very efficient, like a brand new gas or coal station, all of the time. And then you run your most high marginal cost plants least. And when we, in Britain, as one of the leaders, moved to privatize and liberalize our markets, we designed a market structure that effectively ensured that economically rational dispatch model was translated into the new market arrangements. So initially we had a central purchasing agency, took over the role of the monopoly utility, and ran bids and auctions in order to invite power stations to run at particular times of the day. And the market has changed a number of times since then, and I don't think we really have time to go into the detail of that, but the fundamentals still underpin it, which is you have some form of market that gives you economically rational dispatch that meet demand at every instant of the day, running your cheapest plants first.
You did talk about why we have the merit order, and running cheap plants ahead of expensive plants, of course, is quite intuitive. What might be less intuitive is why you would let the most expensive plants set the price for everyone, and not try to capture some of that infra-marginal rent.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. So if you were to, I'll give you the GB market, the UK market instance. If you go back to the 1980s, 80% of our electricity came from coal. Most of that coal was domestically produced. 20% of our electricity came from nuclear. So our principal preoccupation at that time was time of day and time of year economic operation of the system. We weren't thinking about wider geopolitical factors very, very hard. Okay, we didn't really need to. We just needed to make sure that we ran the most efficient plant at the most efficient time. So when we privatized and moved to a market-based system with private operators, we just translated what we've been doing across into that market context. And we still didn't really need to worry about things like, well, maybe there'll be a mega trend in the price of gas, which will overwhelm everything else, which is what we're seeing at the moment. So it made complete sense to have a system whereby you pay the marginal price to the marginal generation plant, and that makes sure that that we have an economically efficient way of getting electricity generated for consumers. As I said earlier, that starts to break down or starts to become more problematic once you start having lots and lots of zero marginal cost generators on the system. And whether or not that kind of way of structuring prices is fundamentally broken, we'll come on to discuss. I'm not convinced it necessarily is, but it's very clear that in extreme circumstances, it leads to extreme outcomes that weren't really anticipated or perhaps given huge priority when the market was first being set up and designed.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Leon, you've also looked at this across markets and across commodities. So could you talk to us a little bit about whether what we're doing in power with the merit order, with pay as clear pricing, is in any way particular to power markets, or whether there's some more fundamental principles at stake here?
Love to do so. So if you listen to the public policy debate, and if you listen to, say, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, explaining this in the front of the European Parliament, which happened just 2 months ago, you get the impression that marginal pricing is something pretty weird, that some weirdos have come up with at the power exchange or in energy economics research departments and invented a principle that applies to electricity that is producing strange results. But that's quite untrue. Marginal pricing or pay as cleared or uniform pricing, as it's sometimes called, is not an artificial way of organizing electricity markets. It's really the natural way of how prices are formed, of how prices emerge in free economies, in all markets, in all commodities. You could say that the commodities price on the margin, and so does electricity. To bring this message home, let me point a simple example from the wheat market. Let's imagine there's two farmers, one a very modern and mechanized farm with low production costs that can produce wheat for $2 per bushel. And another traditional farm with loads of expensive manual labor that yields in production costs of 10. And both farms, the output of both farms is required to meet the demand for wheat. So the more expensive farm will not sell below $10 because otherwise the farm would make a loss. The cheaper farm, however, is observing this and it knows it can sell for 10 because that's what the neighbors do. So why should that second farm sell at anything below 10? It won't. In other words, there will be a uniform price because the goods that these farms produce is uniform. It's the same wheat on both sides, and that price will be determined by the cost of the marginal producer. And that's very same thing for electricity. That's exactly how electricity prices and how electricity markets price production. And that's not the idea, but this is more a description of how individual decisions lead to certain market outcomes. And it's more a way of explaining how prices emerge than a sort of an invention by some central entity, government, or power exchange. There is a crucial difference, of course. Electricity cannot be stored. It cannot be stored economically, and that's very different to wheat. That means where the wheat price is relatively stable, for example, within the day or within the week, wheat is roughly priced the same. That's very different to electricity, where on spot markets we see wide fluctuations, and wholesale markets may price electricity on a cold night 10 times, 100 times higher than the same day during midday when there was a lot of solar generation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Leon. Okay, we've now talked a lot about why we are where we are and why we have the system that we have. So let's talk about how we might change it. And there's a lot of proposals on the table. And I would like to talk through some of the most prominent ones with the two of you. Why don't we start with the idea of splitting markets for renewables and conventional generation. This is an idea that was voiced in the recent UK government publication, the review of electricity market arrangements. The Greek government made a similar proposal within the EU market design debate. Rob, can you take us through what the idea here is and how this might help us with the current situation, or whether it would even help us?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the first things to say is there are different formulations of this idea of a split market. Perhaps the most pure formulation of it would be consumers could choose how reliable they want their electricity to be, or what kind of share of variable renewables they directly or through an intermediary contract for. Whether or not that could ever be made to work in practice, we could have a discussion about, particularly if we're talking about consumers down to the household level, because there's system operation challenges that are associated with that, and also kind of social and equity issues that would follow from it that could be quite significant and profound. But more restricted versions of it would be that perhaps you run two power wholesale market pools, for example, that the renewables go into one and that firm power generators, conventional generators or hydro would go into another, and that those markets might be allowed to clear separately. I'd add, though, that in some respects, we already have de facto split market, insofar as we have already put in place provisional special arrangements for renewables generators over the last 20 years or so, for example, through the provision of feed-in tariffs or priority access, which means that they get to run whenever it's windy or sunny, and the rest of the market has to compensate for them. In the GB market context, we have these things called contracts for difference, which effectively offers a long-run fixed price. The renewables generators and a new nuclear plant, which is yet to be completed, but when operational will also get a contract for difference, where they receive a guaranteed strike price. So that's often discussed separately from the split market concept, but in some respects, it has many of the same characteristics. It is, in fact, an intervention that delivers you a very, very similar outcome to a split market, insofar as some of your generation assets get paid effectively on an average cost rather than a marginal price basis. But that, I think, is where these ideas of splitting the market are where they're trying to go, is this idea that some generators could be paid in a different, to use Leon's example, one of the farms sells all their wheat ahead. And because there's no forward market from the local customers, the government or a government entity steps in and says, well, we'll buy all of your wheat for 10 years at a fixed price. So I would say my view is the fundamentals of an entirely new formulation of some kind of split market, dual market, a wholesale market for variable renewables and a different one for fossil fuel generators. We haven't figured out how we might do that. The detail of that is absent, in my view, from the debate. Whether or not that could really be made to work remains to be seen. We certainly, in my view, can't do that in a hurry. It would need to be thought through very, very carefully. But there are things that we could potentially do much more quickly that would reduce the amount of over-remuneration of some of these cheaper forms of generation as an emergency measure during the next however long it is that gas prices are in crisis.
Let's talk about that. So you view splitting the market, however it might work, and I completely echo your questions here about how would it actually be different from long-term symmetric CFDs, and I mean there's a question about how price formation in this renewable market would even work, because you'll have lots of zero marginal cost generators competing there. But those questions aside, it's probably not something that will help us a lot over the next winter. So what would be shorter term things that could be done in that direction?
Hans, if I may, I would share my short views on one specific proposals of market split. The proposal that was put forward by the Greek government in form of a non-paper that made it up to the agenda of the European Energy Council last month. In very brief terms, the Greek government proposes to lump renewables, nuclear, and fossil cogeneration together to a pool, and that pool is supposed to be dispatched proportionately to demand. So they all go hand in hand, and if demand is low, then all these generators are dispatched down in some sort of central dispatch. Consumers in this setup would pay a mix of the average cost of LCOE of that production pool and the marginal cost of the rest of essentially fossil generation. That, in my view, is not the short-term crisis measure that it was presented. It's certainly not. It's nothing that we can implement in months or even 1 year. It would mean a fundamental change in the way we operate electricity systems and coordinate production and consumption. But let me still point out what I believe being two out of many big concerns that I have with this proposal. First, that specific proposal would yield a hugely inefficient dispatch. Imagine we have a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and cogeneration. And the proposal means we would dispatch down wind, fossil coal generation, nuclear, and solar all proportionately because there's still demand. So essentially, there wouldn't be any preference according to cost or according to carbon intensity in this very heterogeneous pool of generators. The second issue that I see here is that consumers really get very strange price signals. Essentially, you always pay the average cost of this huge pool of generators. That means consumption prices paid by consumers never go down a lot and are always leveled quite a bit. That means where is the incentive for smart dispatch of EV, of heat pumps, of industry? Essentially, that's the idea of having a very supply-focused energy system where we've been working for the last decade to make demand flexible, and that would pretty much be the end of that story. I'm not saying that any market split proposal has that specific same problem, but the one that was published as a non-paper, to the extent that I understood it correctly, certainly does.
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. So again, even if these issues could be sorted out, it's nothing for next winter, and it's questionable whether it would be an effective and efficient solution for the longer term as well. So let's talk about the shorter term, or what could be done for next winter. Rob, you mentioned you had some ideas there.
Yeah, thanks, Han. I mean, what we put into the conversation here in the UK, and I have seen this picked up across Europe more widely. We wrote a little paper. This is UKERC. We wrote it really quickly in April. And the idea that we had is that although in the GB market we have these contracts for difference, they were created through an electricity market reform package back in 2013. And we've been running auctions for new offshore wind farms, for example. And as I mentioned, we've got a contract for a new nuclear power station, but that hasn't been built yet. The result of that is because it's relatively recent, we've only got about 6 gigawatts of generation that's under a CFD at the moment. All of that generation at the moment is being paid below market price. And the difference between their contracted strike price and the wholesale market price, which they still sell their electricity at, they pay back to an entity called the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which is a government-owned entity, and that's passed back through to suppliers. So they're doing a little bit to hold consumer prices down, as long as the suppliers are passing those kind of paybacks or those price reductions through to consumers. Whether they are or not, we could have a conversation about. But our idea essentially was to offer on a voluntary basis, rather than a kind of mandatory retroactive rule change, which could be perceived as being illegal. It would be, and quite bad for future investment. Could we run a voluntary CFD auction for pre-existing renewables and nuclear plants that are not currently under the CFD? Most of our renewables fleet is in receipt of what's called a renewables obligation payment, which was originally a certificate trading scheme. That's now closed. The government is transitioning that so that it takes the form of a feed-in tariff, a premium feed-in tariff. And it made sense in many countries to provide renewables with a subsidy in the past when renewables were expensive and finance needed to be raised on expensive, relatively new technologies. And when wholesale prices were relatively low, and in current terms, very low and stable, So we gave them a kind of premium payment. Our idea would be that nuclear and renewables generators could opt into this voluntary CFD arrangement. The upside for them would be that they get a long-term stable price, which might enable them to do things like invest in repowering, would protect them from the risk, which seems a bit, strange to be worrying about now, but there still will be a risk from an investor perspective that the power prices revert to mean, and that its power prices are always low on windy days, and that existing wind farms, for example, might find it difficult to stay operational in the future. So in return for a long-term contract, they would enter into an arrangement in time for this winter using existing regulatory arrangements that are already in place that would help to reduce prices. And we worked out what the implications for consumers might be, and potentially it's significant. Potentially hundreds of pounds per year reduction in a household bill. This was an idea. We're academics. We float ideas.
Can I ask you something? Because I think that's a great proposal, and I very much love the idea to first explore all voluntary measures before we introduce coercive policies and force people to do some stuff that might end up in court and be unconstitutional in the long term. So voluntary is good. But companies in your proposal will only agree to sign a new CFD if they recover, or if they expect to recover later what they now pay in the short term, right? Because they are profit maximizers, or at least if they get something back that it's similar in size. Let's be very conservative. So doesn't that essentially mean we are lending money from energy firms?
It might do. I understand the point that you're making. Well, there's so many different factors here that we can't even get into the detail of it. We know that there are very high wholesale prices at the moment, and we know that that's above what was expected in order to kind of make payments on any finance that have been raised against, say, a wind farm, operational costs, transmission and distribution costs. So we know that the wholesale price is way above that level now. What we don't know, because quite a lot of this is in the detail of commercially sensitive contracts, is exactly who within the various array of market participants is benefiting from that very high price. Those generators might already have sold their output ahead to a supplier, and maybe they're vertically integrated, maybe their supplier business is making money, maybe the generators themselves are on the spot market and they're making money. I think that what they would need to see is a level of risk balancing. So yes, there's no question that at the moment the sun is out, it's very bright, and they're making hay. They're making big returns. Somebody in the market is making big returns, and if they were to forego that, then they would need to be given some kind of recompense into the long term. But the recompense that they're potentially being offered into the long term is not that they need to make all of the profits that they might otherwise have made in the next 2 or 3 years, but they're getting a long-term stable contract that might enable them to refinance their assets at a lower cost of borrowing, might, as I've said, allow them to invest in repowering their assets, because they have to do a forward projection of what they think prices will be. At the moment, most of the analysis is still saying that prices will revert to trend and to mean. And so there's a trade-off for them, but I don't think it's necessarily quite as straightforward as a transfer payment from the present to the future that means that future prices will be higher than they might otherwise have been. It's a bit more complicated than that.
There's probably a point about cost of capital there as well, right? Because if you can refinance and you've got the 10-year or whatever it is, certainty of a government offtake, you might not need an equivalent cash transfer to view that as equivalent. Yeah. That's
right. I mean, there's a separate conversation at the moment around what are called evergreen CFDs. So the thing about a CFD is for a renewables scheme, it's a 15-year contract. The old renewables obligation contracts were 20-year contracts. Because we've been building out renewables since the early 2000s, quite a large number of generators will be coming to the end of those contracts. So this might have the potential to offer them stable revenues for a longer period into the future and offset some of the uncertainty that they would be facing. But to the extent to which Leon is right, to the extent to which there might be a trade-off between getting prices down now and not having quite such low prices at some point in the future, I think the question has to be: do we want to make that trade-off? Do we want a fixed price mortgage, as it were, at a time when interest rates are going up? And maybe we do, and that's a very difficult political decision that needs to be made. And I have to say, I mean, I'm jumping topics here, but this is something that could be implemented. I think it's potentially, in principle, implementable. I think that any kind of windfall tax in the electricity market is very difficult to implement, because it's quite hard to know where the profits are being made, because there are multiple players: retailers, intermediaries, generators, vertically integrated companies, and so on.
Leon, are these kind of recontracting of renewables in symmetric CFDs? Is that a topic you see gaining traction in the EU or in Germany?
In that specific case, I can't talk much about the EU, but I can talk about Germany, and certainly it does. I mean, our situation is in that specific question much more complicated than the UK situation. The UK has introduced contracts for difference, I think in 2014 for most generation, and that means all the renewables that were built under that subsidy scheme since then, they are now paying back money, and essentially to that extent consumers are hedged. Now Germany did install a quite different scheme that sometimes a bit confusingly is called a one-sided or single-sided CFD. Germans call this the market premium. And that system is not a symmetric risk-sharing agreement. Rather, if prices are low, generators get a subsidy. If prices are high, generators keep the upside. And that was by design, and there's good reasons to do this. But of course, no one ever expected a price crisis of this size when designing that support scheme. And as a consequence, renewable generators that were shielded from market risk through federal policy now really bring home coffers of cash. And of course, the proposal that you outlined, Rob, offering them on a voluntary basis a CFD that they can enter is one way of tapping into that cash. I would argue that's mostly an intertemporal trade, right? We are getting some of that cash today and paying them back later. And you might make the argument that this is essentially a pretty costly way of public lending, and there's better ways of doing this because governments can, at least the German government, can issue bonds at very low interest rates. But I do see all your points, and that's something that we've actually been discussing and thinking through as a research and advising community over the past weeks. It's not clear if that will come to light. There's so many proposals floating that it's hard to see what will make it in the end. But what I like about the proposal is it can be one piece of the puzzle, right? If it's voluntary, really it's doing a lot less damage than all the obligatory measures. So I do see the benefits of maybe offering this and then see how the market responds.
You both mentioned other proposals that are floating. There's two that I would like to bring to the table, and you may have others you want to discuss. The two that I would see value in discussing for a bit is, on the one hand, capping gas prices for the power sector, as Spain has done. And then this whole discussion about windfall taxes, which Rob brought up. Leon, do you want to start on gas price caps? How that might work? How it's supposed to address the current problems, and whether you see that working?
Happy to do so. Some of our listeners might have seen that we've published something ahead of the introduction in April, and you might remember we've been pretty critical about that measure. And there's more analysis coming up next week from our end. So we've looked into this quite in depth. I don't like to call this a cap on gas because it's not an administrative cap on the price of gas like other people have suggested. Rather, I see it as a subsidy for fossil generator with the intention to reduce the variable cost of production and hence lower the price on spot markets for electricity. And that subsidy is then financed through a new tax, or technically it's a levy on electricity consumption. So you essentially take away money from electricity consumers, you give it to fossil generators. But because fossil generators only concern a little bit of generation, that essentially means you're taking away money from the inframarginal generators, from renewables, from nuclear, from coal, and redistribute that money to consumers. So if things go right, the net benefit to consumers is still positive. That proposal is, or that it's actually implemented since mid-June, so it's not a proposal, it's a policy, has many problems. It causes increased export, so it causes leakage. It increases gas consumption, so it drives up the gas price. But let's ignore those problems for a second and focus on something that I think is really important for the broader European context, and because Rob mentioned it. The whole idea of the Spanish-Portuguese policy is that it's spot markets, it's short-term day-ahead markets that matter. This is seen as the centerpiece of the electricity market, and this is where the policy focuses on. But reality is there is huge markets for future and forward contracts. So typically, conventional generators sell energy 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years ahead of production through financial forwards and future contracts. In other words, they hedge. So picture the case of a coal plant that has sold all of its outputs through a financial forward. That plant is completely indifferent to the spot price. If spot prices go up, spot prices go down, their profits are locked in. They don't care. But in the Spanish proposal, they still get the subsidy. They're still subsidized in order to change their spot market behavior. Rather than taking away windfall profits from these coal plants, that policy would create a new windfall for a hedged coal generator. And that's certainly not what we want to do. So the bottom line of this is, when we think about wholesale market intervention, we need to take future markets serious. We can't stop at spot markets. We need to take into account that most generators and most retail suppliers are hedged and have locked in prices 1, 2, 3, 4 years ahead of time.
So plenty of issues with that around efficiency of the demand side responding, but also additional windfall profits in the futures markets. Rob, do you have any views on the Spanish model?
Rather than focusing on the specifics of the Spanish proposal, I think I'll just make a few general observations. The first is, I completely agree that there will be some unintended consequences and some distortionary impacts. Almost anything that you could imagine doing to intervene in a wholesale market will have unintended consequences. The contracts for difference have had unintended consequences. Liberalisation itself has unintended, unenvisaged consequences, such as the dash for gas during the 1990s, which nobody foresaw. But this does have a political and macroeconomic overlay that I don't think that we should neglect in our conversation. So, for example, in most countries, electricity prices will turn up in the consumer price index, which is used to calculate headline inflation. And so there's a strong incentive on governments to try and push electricity prices down, because that will help to hold inflation down. And when they look at the tools that they've got to kind of control inflationary pressure, they can see with a bit of analysis, well, maybe we could intervene in the wholesale electricity market. Maybe we could have a negotiated agreement with generators like they've been effectively done in France. Maybe we could cap wholesale prices as they've effectively done on the Iberian Peninsula. We've had the experience in the British market during last winter that a downstream price cap, a price cap on retailers, does not work in these circumstances. Suppliers just go bust, particularly the ones that aren't hedged, to come back to one of Leon's points. So governments understandably will be looking at what they can do. And I think also understandably, they will be more nervous about massive fiscal transfers in order to help consumers, because that's the obvious way of fixing this. It's just we say, okay, this is unprecedented. There's a war in Europe. We're going to give all of the poorer consumers €2,000 to pay their electricity bills, and governments are doing that to a certain extent. But I think it's very understandable that they look to do other things, and that perhaps they care less at the highest political level about the distortionary impact of meddling about in electricity markets, than they do about the fact that it might take 1 percentage point off the headline inflation rate.
So we need to come to the end of the podcast, but before doing so, I would like to briefly discuss windfall taxes, which could provide the funding for some of the transfers, which you mentioned, Rob, which are already taking place, but which will have to be scaled up massively across Europe over the winter. Otherwise, I think a lot of consumers won't be able to cope. Leo and Rob, any parting thoughts on windfall taxes?
So I can share my view on this. So when I say windfall taxes, also that term is used in very different ways in the debate. When I say windfall profit taxes, I do mean profit taxes on firm profits, right? So that's essentially really more a topic. I'm not an expert on this. Essentially, that's then public finance and tax law and income, corporate income taxation that really is concerned, and less energy markets. Still, I want to share my view as an energy market person that markets fulfill all kind of purposes, in particular allocate resources in an efficient way, both short-term and long-term. And if you want to take away profits, then the right way to do this is use the corporate tax system and not mingle with wholesale markets, and not try to disturb prices in a way that reduces profits, rather increase the corporate tax rate specific to that sector. So while I do see a number of problems, and maybe a tax lawyer would be even more critical than I am, I do think windfall profit taxes make much more sense than interfering with wholesale markets. Thank you, Leon. Would you agree, Rob?
I would agree in terms of economic theory. I think it's the political context is a bit more complicated, and also I think pragmatically it's quite tricky when it's hard to know within some of these entities within the electricity market exactly who's making how much profit, particularly for vertically integrated companies, and also in the specifics of the GB market, when we've had a number of suppliers that went bust during the course of last winter as a result of the retail market price cap. So I suppose pragmatically, windfall taxes in some political contexts are very difficult. I think in our context in Britain, we've got a right-wing, quite populist government. It doesn't like the idea of tax, full stop. And so it's tricky. It has a political overlay. All of the points of principle that Leon makes are completely right. And in a way, I'll just come back to my previous answer that I think it's, in many respects, it's the high politics of this that count at the moment. And I think my final observation would be that whether it's a windfall tax, whether it's an intervention, temporary or permanent, in the wholesale market for electricity, history teaches us that when we're in a time of war, the role of governments becomes much more profound and interventionist. And there is a war in Europe. And hopefully that will be a conflict which is not very long-lived, doesn't escalate, and everything will come back to normal. I mean, that's what we all want. But we should expect governments to be prepared to do things that they wouldn't have countenanced. I'd say certainly pre-COVID, perhaps even a year ago.
No, absolutely. And I think that's why we're having this discussion, which unfortunately now has to come to an end. I thought it was fascinating. Thank you very much for joining and for sharing your thoughts on this. What I'm taking from it is that it's complicated. And to quote Rob, any policy will have unintended consequences. My takeaway from this discussion is that we should be very careful about making very drastic changes to respond to an emergency without having had time to think about these consequences very carefully. But clearly there's a lot of pressure to do something, and anything may look more attractive than the status quo, which may in the longer term actually not be the case. Thank you very much for joining us, Rob, and thank you very much for joining us, Leon. It's been a pleasure discussing with you, and let's stay in touch.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great fun.
That was Hans Koenig, Head of Commission Projects for Central Europe at Aurora, talking to Leon Hirth, Professor of Energy Policy at the Hertie School in Berlin, and Robert Gross, Director at UKERC and Professor of Energy Policy at Imperial College London. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.